To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Mask of Mediocrity. Benjamin Ben Rourke adjusted his worn tie in the cracked mirror of the courthouse break room, watching his reflection with cold calculation. To everyone around him, he was just another government clerk, filing paperwork and stamping documents for 23 years. His colleagues saw a quiet man who brought bologna sandwiches in brown bags and drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with rust spots. They had no idea that Benjamin Rourke was one of the most dangerous men in the city. His real profession wasn't listed on any tax return or employment record. Ben was a fixer, the kind of man powerful people called when problems needed to disappear. Politicians, crime bosses, corrupt judges, and desperate billionaires all had his private number. Over 2 decades, he'd accumulated enough secrets, favors, and offshore accounts to topple governments. Yet he maintained his clerk job as the perfect cover, a gray man in a gray office whom nobody would ever suspect. The only person who'd known his true nature was his mentor, Vincent Ashcroft, a legendary fixer who'd taken Ben under his wing 25 years ago. Vincent had taught him that the most powerful weapon wasn't money or violence. It was invisibility. Let them think you're nothing, Vincent had said before his death. When they finally see who you really are, it'll be far too late. Ben's phone buzzed. A text from his wife, Linda. Working late again. Don't wait up. He smiled coldly. Linda thought she was clever, but Ben had been watching her for months. He knew about her affair with Trevor Halloway, his father-in-law's business partner. He knew about their weekend trips to the cabin, their plans to leave him once Trevor's divorce was finalized. Most importantly, he knew they both saw him as a pathetic obstacle to overcome. Tonight, Linda was at Trevor's penthouse, probably laughing about her loser husband, while they planned their future together. What they didn't know was that Ben had been planning too, a plan 23 years in the making. Walking to his car, Ben reflected on how he'd met Linda. She'd been a struggling real estate agent, beautiful but desperate for security. Her father, Ronald Pierce, owned Pierce Holdings, a mid-sized construction company that was hemorrhaging money due to poor decisions. Ben had presented himself as a stable, boring choice. Exactly what Linda thought she needed after a string of unreliable boyfriends. The marriage had been genuine at first. Ben had even considered revealing his true profession, but Linda's growing disdain for his lack of ambition convinced him to maintain the charade. When she started the affair, he'd felt something die inside him. Not love, but the last vestige of mercy he possessed. Now, as he drove through the city lights, Ben finalized his revenge. It would be elegant, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Linda and Trevor wanted him gone. He'd give them exactly what they deserved. Chapter 2. The Father-in-Law's Empire. Ben sat in the back corner of Romano's restaurant, observing his target through wire-rimmed glasses. Ronald Pierce cut an imposing figure, 6 feet tall, silver hair, expensive suit, holding court with his business partners at their weekly dinner. To anyone watching, Ben appeared to be a lonely clerk nursing a beer and reading a newspaper. Ronald had always despised him. From their first meeting, Linda's father had made it clear that Ben wasn't good enough for his daughter. The insults had started subtly, comments about Ben's limited potential and suggestions that Linda deserved someone more ambitious. Over the years, they'd grown more vicious. What Ronald didn't know was that Ben had been carefully studying Pierce Holdings for months. The company's financials were a mess, held together by desperate loans and increasingly risky projects. More importantly, Ben had discovered that Ronald was on the verge of losing everything to a rival development firm, Hartwell Industries. Through his network of contacts, Ben learned that Hartwell's CEO, Margaret Hartwell, had been quietly buying up Pierce Holdings' debt. She was positioning herself to force a hostile takeover within 6 months. Ronald had no idea that his empire was about to crumble, but Ben had a different plan. 3 weeks earlier, using one of his shell companies, Ben had approached Hartwell with a proposition. He offered to buy Pierce Holdings' debt at a premium, claiming he represented anonymous investors interested in the construction business. Hartwell, seeing an opportunity for quick profit without the messy takeover process, had agreed. Now Ben owned 73% of Pierce Holdings' debt, making him the company's de facto controller. He'd done it all through carefully layered corporations and offshore accounts, ensuring his involvement remained invisible. To the world, Benjamin Rourke was still just a clerk who couldn't afford to eat at Romano's. Ben watched Ronald laugh loudly at his own joke, slapping Trevor Halloway on the back. Trevor, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s with perfectly styled hair and a predatory smile, had joined Pierce Holdings as a partner 2 years ago. He'd brought some capital and connections, but more importantly, he'd brought charm and ambition, everything Ronald thought Ben lacked. What neither man realized was that Trevor's investment hadn't saved the company. It had merely delayed the inevitable. Ben had made sure of that, quietly sabotaging several key deals through his network of contacts. Each failure had pushed Pierce Holdings deeper into debt, closer to the trap Ben had been setting. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda. "Dad's dinner running late. We'll be home by 11. Ben knew she was lying. His surveillance equipment had captured her entering Trevor's building an hour ago. She was probably in Trevor's bed right now, discussing their plans for when Ben was out of the picture. Trevor had promised to take care of Linda once he gained more control of Pierce Holdings, a control that would never come. Ben finished his beer and left a modest tip, playing his role to perfection. Tomorrow, he would begin the final phase of his plan. The confrontation at the board meeting was still weeks away, but the pieces were almost in position. As he walked to his Honda, Ben allowed himself a rare smile. Vincent Ashcroft would have been proud. The perfect revenge required patience, invisibility, and the ability to think 10 moves ahead. Ben had learned well. Chapter 3: The Perfect Storm. Dr. Alice Brennan finished her evening rounds at Mercy General Hospital, exhausted but satisfied with her patient's progress. As one of the city's most respected cardiac surgeons, she was used to life-and-death decisions, but nothing had prepared her for the moral dilemma that had consumed her thoughts for the past 6 months. Alice had discovered Trevor Halloway's darkest secret by accident. It had started with a routine surgery on a homeless man named Frank Morrison. During the operation, Alice noticed unusual scarring patterns on Frank's torso, the kind that suggested previous medical procedures. When she questioned Frank afterward, he'd broken down and revealed a horrifying truth. 3 years earlier, Frank had been a construction worker for Pierce Holdings. A scaffolding collapse on one of Trevor's job sites had left Frank with severe internal injuries. Instead of ensuring proper medical care, Trevor had bribed the attending physician to misdiagnose Frank's condition, claiming he was just a drug-seeking addict. Frank's compensation claim was denied, he lost his job, and his subsequent medical bills had cost him his home and family. But Trevor's cruelty hadn't stopped there. When Frank tried to hire a lawyer, Trevor had used his connections to ensure no reputable firm would take the case. When Frank went to the media, Trevor's influence had killed the stories. Broken and hopeless, Frank had ended up on the streets. Alice had verified Frank's story through hospital records and her own investigation. She'd documented everything, knowing it was enough to destroy Trevor professionally and legally. But she'd hesitated to act, knowing that exposing Trevor would also devastate Pierce Holdings and its hundreds of employees. That hesitation had eaten at her conscience until last week, when a mutual friend had mentioned that Ben Rourke was her patient's brother-in-law. Alice didn't know Ben well, but she'd always respected his quiet dignity. Learning about his wife's affair with the man who destroyed Frank Morrison had crystallized her decision. Tonight, Alice sat in her car outside Ben's modest apartment building, debating whether to involve him in her moral crusade. She'd brought copies of all her documentation, medical records, witness statements, photographic evidence of Trevor's systematic destruction of Frank Morrison's life. Ben emerged from the building at exactly 9:47 p.m., just as Alice had observed for the past 3 nights. He walked with the unremarkable gait of a man who'd perfected the art of being overlooked. Alice rolled down her window. "Mr. Rourke? I'm Dr. Alice Brennan. I need to speak with you about Trevor Halloway." Ben stopped, his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, doctor, but I don't know anyone by that name." "I think you do," Alice said quietly. "And I think you'd be very interested in what I've discovered about him." For a long moment, Ben studied her face. Alice saw something flicker in his eyes, not surprise, but calculation. When he finally nodded and approached her car, she realized she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. "Drive," Ben said, sliding into the passenger seat. "We have a lot to discuss." As Alice pulled into traffic, Neither of them noticed the private investigator in the black sedan who'd been photographing their meeting. Trevor Halloway had been paranoid enough to have been watched for weeks, hoping to find leverage for the inevitable divorce proceedings. The investigator smiled as he reviewed the photos on his camera. Dr. Brennan was a respected professional with an impeccable reputation. Her secret meeting with Ben Rourke was exactly the kind of ammunition Trevor needed to paint Ben as an unstable husband plotting against his wife's new relationship. The investigator had no idea he'd just documented the formation of an alliance that would destroy everything Trevor had built. Chapter 4: The Web Titans. Ben's basement workshop looked like the lair of a madman to the untrained eye. Wall-mounted monitors displayed feeds from dozens of hidden cameras. Cork boards covered with photographs, financial documents, and red string created a complex web of connections. Voice recording equipment sat next to sophisticated computer terminals that could hack into virtually any system. This was Ben's real office, where Benjamin Rourke the clerk disappeared and the fixer emerged. Dr. Alice Brennan sat in stunned silence as Ben explained his true profession. Over the past 2 hours, he'd revealed enough of his background to convince her that Trevor Halloway had chosen the wrong enemy. Ben's network of contacts included judges, politicians, police commissioners, and federal agents, all of whom owed him favors or feared his knowledge of their secrets. Frank Morrison was just the beginning, Alice said, reviewing the documentation she'd brought. I've identified 6 other construction workers who suffered similar fates on Trevor's projects. The pattern is clear. Anyone who gets injured becomes a liability to be eliminated. Ben nodded grimly. Trevor's been using intimidation and financial pressure to silence victims for years. But that's not his only crime. Ben pulled up a series of financial records on his computer. I've been tracking Trevor's investment in Pierce Holdings. The money didn't come from legitimate sources. It's connected to a real estate laundering scheme involving Russian oligarchs. Trevor's been using Pierce Holdings to clean dirty money through inflated construction contracts. Alice leaned forward, studying the data. That explains why he's so desperate to gain control of the company. It's not about Linda or even the money. It's about survival. If the money laundering operation gets exposed, he goes to federal prison for 20 years, Ben finished. Which is exactly what's going to happen. Ben's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and smiled coldly. Perfect timing. Linda just confirmed she'll be at her father's house tomorrow night for their family dinner. Trevor will be there too. Ronald's been trying to convince the other board members to make Trevor his successor. What are you planning? Alice asked. Ben turned to face her, his expression deadly serious. Tomorrow night, I'm going to destroy all of them in front of everyone they respect. Ronald Pierce, Trevor Halloway, and my dear wife Linda are about to learn that underestimating Benjamin Rourke was the biggest mistake of their lives. Meanwhile, across town, Linda Rourke was having second thoughts. She stood on Trevor's penthouse balcony, watching the city lights while he made drinks inside. The private investigator's photos had arrived that afternoon. Images of Ben meeting with Dr. Alice Brennan in what appeared to be a secretive rendezvous. Trevor had been furious, convinced that Ben was either having an affair or plotting some kind of revenge. He'd shown the photos to Linda as evidence that her husband wasn't the innocent victim she'd assumed him to be. But Linda knew Ben better than Trevor realized. Her husband wasn't the type for affairs. He was too rigid, too moral. If he was meeting secretly with a doctor, there had to be another explanation. The thought that Ben might know about her affair, might be planning something, sent chills down her spine. You're overthinking this, Trevor said, joining her on the balcony with 2 glasses of wine. Ben's a nobody, a clerk who files papers and goes home to watch television. Whatever he's planning, I can handle it. Linda wanted to believe him, but a nagging fear had been growing for weeks. She'd started noticing things, the way Ben watched her sometimes, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. The way he'd stopped asking about her whereabouts, as if he already knew the answers. The subtle changes in his routine that suggested he was preparing for something. What if we're wrong about him? She asked quietly. Trevor laughed, pulling her close. Baby, I've been destroying men like Ben Rourke my entire career. He's an ant, and I'm about to step on him. Neither of them noticed the nearly invisible drone hovering outside the penthouse window, recording their conversation with military-grade surveillance equipment. Ben's preparations had been far more thorough than they could imagine. Chapter 5: the gathering storm. The Pierce family mansion buzzed with tension as Ronald Pierce's inner circle gathered for what he'd announced as a family dinner with important business discussions. The dining room table seated 12, with Ronald at the head, Linda to his right, and Trevor positioned strategically across from the other board members. Ben had arrived exactly on time, carrying a bottle of modest wine and wearing his usual unremarkable suit. The other guests, board members, their wives, and key investors, barely acknowledged his presence. To them, he was Linda's unfortunate choice in husbands, tolerated only out of respect for Ronald's daughter. Dr. Alice Brennan had arrived separately, introduced as a family friend who'd helped with medical issues related to Pierce Holdings workers' compensation claims. Her presence seemed innocuous, though Trevor had shot her several suspicious glances throughout cocktails. "Before we eat," Ronald announced, tapping his wine glass with a knife, "I want to address the future of Pierce Holdings. As you all know, the construction industry is becoming increasingly competitive. We need fresh leadership, innovative thinking, and most importantly, the kind of vision that can take us to the next level." He gestured toward Trevor, who stood with practiced confidence. "Trevor Holloway has brought new energy to our company. His partnership has already resulted in several major contracts, and his connections in the development community are invaluable. That's why I'm proposing that we restructure the company with Trevor as my successor and eventual majority partner." The board members nodded approvingly. Trevor's charm had won them over completely, and his apparent success made him seem like the obvious choice. Linda beamed with pride, already imagining herself as the wife of a construction empire's heir apparent. Ben remained silent, cutting his steak with mechanical precision. Alice watched him carefully, noting the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw that suggested he was fighting to control something powerful. "Of course," Ronald continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone, "this is still a family matter. Linda's husband, Ben, has been part of our family for 8 years now. I suppose we should ask for his thoughts on the company's future." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Ben. Ronald's smile was cruel, clearly expecting his son-in-law to either stay silent or embarrass himself with some bumbling comment about not understanding business. Trevor leaned back in his chair, practically radiating smugness. "Yes, Ben, I'd love to hear your perspective on corporate strategy." Ben slowly set down his fork and looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. When he spoke, his voice was steady and calm, with an undertone that made several people shift uncomfortably. "Actually, Ronald, I have been thinking about the company's future. In fact, I've been thinking about it quite extensively." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it carefully on the table. "I've been particularly interested in Pierce Holdings' debt structure, your recent partnership agreements, and some fascinating irregularities in your project financing." Ronald's smile began to falter. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ben." "I mean," Ben said, opening the envelope and spreading documents across the table, "that Pierce Holdings is currently $73 million in debt to various financial institutions. I also mean that as of last Friday, I purchased all of that debt through a consortium of investment companies." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Trevor sat forward, his face suddenly pale. "That's impossible. You're a clerk. You don't have that kind of money." Ben smiled for the first time all evening, and several people instinctively leaned away from him. "You're absolutely right, Trevor. Benjamin Rourke the clerk doesn't have that kind of money. But Benjamin Rourke the businessman, the one who's been operating under various corporate entities for the past 20 years, certainly does." Chapter 6. The Revelation. "He's just a lowly clerk," Ronald Pierce had boomed to his business partners only days earlier, Linda laughing alongside him as they mocked Ben's apparent lack of ambition. Now, as Ben spread financial documents across the dinner table, those words seemed to echo in the stunned silence. "Let me explain how this works," Ben continued, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone. "When you purchase someone's debt, you essentially own their ability to continue operating. Pierce Holdings owes money to banks, suppliers, subcontractors, and equipment leasing companies. As of last Friday, I own all of those obligations." He pulled out a thick folder marked Pierce Holdings Acquisition and set it in front of Ronald. "This means I can call in these debts immediately, force bankruptcy proceedings, or—" He paused for effect. "I can restructure the company under new ownership." My ownership. Trevor slammed his hand on the table, causing wine glasses to rattle. This is ridiculous. You can't just buy a company out from under us. There are legal procedures, board votes, regulatory approvals. Dr. Alice Brennan finally spoke, her voice cutting through Trevor's bluster. Actually, Mr. Halloway, when a company is insolvent and facing immediate bankruptcy, emergency restructuring can happen very quickly, especially when the debt holder has legitimate concerns about fraud or mismanagement. She pulled out her own folder, considerably thicker than Ben's. Which brings us to the other matter we need to discuss tonight. Trevor's eyes darted between Ben and Alice, clearly recognizing that he'd walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. What other matter? Alice opened her folder, revealing photographs, medical records, and sworn statements. Frank Morrison, Billy Garrison, David Chun, Maria Santos, Carlos Rodriguez, Jenny Thompson. Should I continue? The names meant nothing to most people at the table, but Trevor's face had gone completely white. Ronald looked confused, while Linda stared at her husband with growing horror as she began to realize the scope of what was happening. These are all construction workers who were injured on Pierce Holdings job sites over the past 3 years, Alice continued. Workers whose medical care was deliberately sabotaged, whose compensation claims were fraudulently denied, and whose lives were systematically destroyed to protect the company's insurance rates and legal liability. She placed a photograph of Frank Morrison on the table, the homeless man, gaunt and scarred, staring directly at the camera. Frank Morrison worked for Pierce Holdings for 8 years. He had a wife, 2 children, and a mortgage he was 6 months away from paying off. After his accident, Trevor Halloway bribed Dr. Kenneth Walsh to misdiagnose Frank's injuries as drug-seeking behavior. Frank lost his job, his insurance claim was denied, and his subsequent medical bills bankrupted his family. Trevor stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. These are lies. Fabricated evidence. I don't know what kind of conspiracy you two have cooked up, but sit down, Ben said quietly. Something in his tone made Trevor freeze. For the first time, people at the table were seeing Ben as something other than a harmless clerk. The authority in his voice, the cold calculation in his eyes, and the precise way he'd orchestrated this confrontation suggested a man far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. You're going to sit down, Trevor, because we're not finished yet. Dr. Brennan has documented evidence of your systematic abuse of injured workers. But that's just the beginning of your problems. Ben pulled out a new set of documents, these marked with federal agency letterheads. Your investment in Pierce Holdings, the $2.3 million you used to buy your partnership, came from offshore accounts connected to Viktor Kozlov's real estate laundering operation. You've been using Pierce Holdings to wash Russian money through inflated construction contracts. He spread out bank records, wire transfer receipts, and surveillance photographs showing Trevor meeting with known associates of the Russian oligarch. The FBI has been building a case against Kozlov's network for 18 months. Guess whose name keeps appearing in their financial analysis? The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Linda's sharp, panicked breathing. She stared at her husband, this stranger who had somehow transformed from a quiet clerk into someone who could casually destroy lives with manila folders full of evidence. Ronald finally found his voice. Ben, how did you? Where did all this come from? Ben looked at his father-in-law with something approaching pity. 23 years, Ronald. 23 years I've sat at your dinner table while you mocked my lack of ambition. 23 years I've listened to you tell Linda she deserved someone better. 23 years of being dismissed as insignificant. He stood up slowly, straightening his unremarkable tie. The truth is, I've been one of the most successful fixers on the East Coast for over 2 decades. I've solved problems for senators, judges, crime bosses, and Fortune 500 CEOs. I've accumulated enough wealth to buy and sell your little construction company a dozen times over. Linda finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Why? Why did you pretend to be someone else? Ben looked at his wife, really looked at her, for what both of them knew would be the last time. Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I couldn't fight back. I wanted to know if you would love me when you believed I was ordinary. He gestured toward Trevor, who had slumped back into his chair in defeated silence. Instead, I discovered that you'd rather betray me with a man who destroys lives for profit than remain faithful to someone you thought was beneath you. Chapter 7. The trap springs. As the new majority shareholder, Ben continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "You're all fired." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ronald Pierce, who had built his company over 30 years, stared at the documents scattered across his dinner table as if they were written in a foreign language. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their comfortable positions and generous compensation packages had just evaporated. But Ben wasn't finished. Dr. Brennan has already filed complaints with the Medical Ethics Board regarding Dr. Walsh's fraudulent diagnoses. The FBI will receive copies of all evidence regarding Trevor's money laundering operation first thing Monday morning. The district attorney's office will be investigating the systematic fraud committed against injured workers. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be an extensive contact list. I've also taken the liberty of contacting Channel 7 News, the city newspaper, and 3 different personal injury law firms who specialize in construction accident cases. Frank Morrison and the other victims will finally get their day in court. Trevor lurched to his feet again, desperation replacing his earlier arrogance. "You can't do this. I have connections too. I have friends in high places." Ben smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "You mean friends like Judge Harrison, who owes his appointment to my intervention in a blackmail scandal? Or Commissioner Bradley, whose gambling debts I paid off in exchange for certain favors? Or perhaps Senator Walsh, no relation to your corrupt doctor, who I helped cover up that unfortunate hit-and-run incident last year?" With each name, Trevor's face grew paler. He was beginning to understand that Ben's network of influence extended far beyond anything he'd imagined. "The truth is, Trevor, everyone you think of as a friend is actually in my debt. When they have to choose between helping a money-laundering construction partner or maintaining their relationship with someone who holds their darkest secrets, what do you think they'll choose?" Linda suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Stop. Just stop. What do you want, Ben? Money? An apology? What will it take to end this?" Ben turned to his wife, studying her face with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "What I want, Linda, is justice. What I want is for everyone in this room to understand that actions have consequences." He walked around the table, approaching her slowly. "You chose to betray our marriage vows with a man who cripples workers and steals from them. Your father chose to mock and demean someone he thought was helpless. Trevor chose to build his fortune by destroying innocent lives." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the cold fury burning in his eyes. "What I want is for all of you to experience the same helplessness you thought you were inflicting on me." Dr. Alice Brennan had remained silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "There's something else you should all know. I've been recording this entire conversation." She pulled a small digital recorder from her purse and set it on the table. Trevor's admissions about the fraudulent medical diagnoses, his connections to money laundering, and his threats to use corrupt officials to escape justice. It's all documented. The room erupted in chaos. Board members began arguing among themselves, some demanding explanations while others tried to distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. Ronald Pierce slumped in his chair, looking like he'd aged 20 years in the span of an hour. But Ben's attention was focused on Linda, who had begun to cry. Not the manipulative tears she'd used to get her way throughout their marriage, but genuine sobs of someone whose world was collapsing. "Please," she whispered. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling. I'll end things with Trevor. I'll do whatever you want." Ben reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, the gesture almost tender. Then his expression hardened again. "No, Linda, we can't work this out. Because you didn't just cheat on me. You chose to cheat with someone who destroys lives for profit. You laughed when your father called me worthless. You planned to take half of everything I owned in a divorce while believing I was just a lowly clerk." He stepped back, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Most importantly, you never loved me. You loved the security you thought I provided, the stable life you thought I represented. But you never loved Ben Rourke the man." The recorder continued to capture every word as Ben delivered his final verdict. "So now you get to learn what it feels like to lose everything you thought was yours. Your marriage, your father's company, your lover's freedom, and your comfortable future. All of it is gone." Chapter 8. The Reckoning. 3 weeks after the dinner party that destroyed 3 lives, Ben sat in his real office, a corner suite in the city's most exclusive financial district that he'd owned for 15 years under a corporate alias. The modest clerk apartment had been abandoned, along with the Honda Civic and the brown bag lunches. Benjamin Rourke the fixer no longer needed to hide. The view from his office window showed the construction site where Pierce Holdings had been building their last project before the bankruptcy. Work had stopped completely when Ben called in the company's debts, leaving a half-finished skeleton of steel and concrete that would likely remain unfinished for years. Dr. Alice Brennan knocked on his office door, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd become his unlikely partner in ensuring justice for Trevor's victims. Her medical expertise and Ben's financial resources had proven to be a devastating combination. The personal injury lawsuits have been filed, she reported, settling into the chair across from his desk. Frank Morrison's case alone is seeking $12 million in damages. With 6 victims and clear evidence of systematic fraud, Trevor's looking at financial ruin even before the criminal charges. Ben nodded, reviewing the criminal complaints on his desk. The FBI arrested him this morning. Money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges. The federal prosecutor thinks they can get him 25 years without a plea deal. What about Dr. Walsh? Medical license revoked, criminal charges pending. He's been cooperating fully, hoping for a reduced sentence. Turns out Trevor wasn't his only client. He's been falsifying medical reports for insurance fraud cases across 3 states. Alice leaned forward, her expression troubled. I have to ask, Ben, did you know about Trevor's crimes before you started planning your revenge? Or did you discover them during your investigation? Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline. I knew Trevor was dirty the moment he invested in Pierce Holdings. Men don't acquire that kind of cash overnight without cutting corners. But I didn't know the extent of his cruelty until you brought me Frank Morrison's case. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Does it matter? Would you feel better about our partnership if I told you I was purely motivated by justice for injured workers instead of revenge against my cheating wife? I suppose it doesn't matter, Alice admitted. The result is the same. Trevor's victims finally get justice, and a dangerous man is removed from society. Ben's assistant knocked and entered with a newspaper. The headline read, Construction Empire Crumbles, Executive Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme. Below it was a smaller story. Pierce Holdings bankruptcy leaves hundreds unemployed. Any regrets about the collateral damage? Alice asked, noting the employment story. Pierce Holdings was failing regardless, Ben replied. Ronald's mismanagement and Trevor's schemes had doomed the company anyway. At least this way, the workers will get severance packages from the bankruptcy settlement instead of just losing their jobs when the company collapsed naturally. He pulled out another file. This one marked Settlement Negotiations. I've arranged for a competitor to acquire Pierce Holdings' legitimate assets and honor all employee contracts. The workers will keep their jobs. Only the corrupt executives lose everything. Alice was impressed despite herself. You really did think of everything, didn't you? 23 years of planning, Ben confirmed. I always knew this day would come eventually. Linda's affair just accelerated the timeline. His phone buzzed with a text message. Ben read it and smiled coldly. Speaking of Linda, she's asking to meet tonight. Apparently, she has something important to discuss. Are you going to see her? Ben stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city he'd spent decades learning to control. Linda still thinks she can manipulate me. She believes that if she apologizes sincerely enough, if she promises to change, if she plays the victim of Trevor's manipulation, I might take her back. He turned to face Alice, his eyes reflecting the same cold calculation that had destroyed Trevor and Ronald. She's about to learn the most important lesson of her life. Benjamin Rourke never forgives, and he never forgets. Chapter 9, The Final Judgment. Linda Pierce Rourke waited in the coffee shop where she'd first met Ben 9 years ago, her hands shaking as she stirred sugar into her 3rd cup of coffee. The past month had been a nightmare of legal papers, bankruptcy proceedings, and media attention. Her father's company was gone. Trevor was in federal custody, and her comfortable life had evaporated overnight. But she still believed she could salvage something from the wreckage. Ben arrived exactly on time, looking more like a successful businessman than the clerk she'd been married to for 8 years. His suit was expensive, his posture confident, and his eyes held a hardness that made her stomach clench with fear. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm curious about what you have to say," Ben replied, his tone neutral. "Though I should mention that our divorce papers were filed this morning. You'll be served tomorrow." Linda's carefully prepared speech suddenly felt inadequate. "Ben, I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But Trevor manipulated me. He made me believe that you would never amount to anything, that I was wasting my life being married to someone without ambition." She reached across the table, trying to take his hand, but he pulled back. "I was wrong. I was stupid and selfish and cruel. But underneath all of that, I did love you. Maybe not the way I should have, but there was something real there." Ben studied her face with the detached interest of someone examining evidence. "What is it you want, Linda?" "I want a chance to make this right. I want to go to counseling, to work on our marriage, to prove that I can be the wife you deserved all along." She was crying now, the tears genuine but calculated. "I know you're angry. I know you want to punish me. But destroying my entire life, ruining my father's company, putting Trevor in prison, hasn't that been enough? Can't we find a way to move forward together?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, watching pedestrians pass by the coffee shop window. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and calm. "Do you know what the worst part was, Linda? It wasn't the betrayal itself. It wasn't even the lies or the sneaking around. The worst part was listening to you and your father mock me, knowing that you both saw me as less than human." He turned back to her, his eyes reflecting no warmth whatsoever. "You didn't just cheat on your husband. You cheated on someone you believed was helpless to fight back. You chose to destroy someone you thought was weak and defenseless." Linda's tears were coming faster now. "But you're not helpless. You're powerful and successful, and—" "That's not the point," Ben interrupted. "The point is that you thought I was helpless, and you decided to destroy me anyway. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You want to know if I can forgive you? If we can work this out? Here's your answer. I would rather spend the rest of my life alone than spend another day married to someone capable of such casual cruelty." Ben stood up, straightening his expensive jacket. "The divorce papers include a settlement offer. You'll receive $50,000 and the Honda Civic. Everything else, the house, the bank accounts, the investments, belongs to me." Linda stared at him in shock. $50,000? Ben, that's nothing. The house alone is worth $500,000. The house was purchased with my money, through my corporations, before we were married. Legally, you have no claim to it. Same with the investments, the accounts, and everything else you thought was half yours." He pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the table. "The car and $50,000 is more than you deserve, but I'm not completely without mercy. It's enough to start over somewhere else, which is what I suggest you do." Linda opened the envelope with trembling hands, reading the legal documents that would make her divorce final. "This is vindictive. This is cruel. You're destroying my life over a mistake." Ben looked down at her, his expression completely unmoved by her tears. "Linda, your life was always a lie. You were married to a wealthy, powerful man for 8 years, but you were too blinded by your own prejudices to see him. You chose to betray someone you thought was beneath you, and now you get to live with the consequences." He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "One more thing. If you ever contact me again, if you ever try to use the media to paint yourself as a victim, if you ever interfere with my life in any way, I will ensure that the rest of your existence becomes far more unpleasant than it already is." Linda sat alone in the coffee shop, clutching the divorce papers that represented the end of everything she'd thought she wanted. Outside, Ben walked to a black Mercedes-Benz and drove away, leaving her to contemplate the ruins of a life built on the assumption that cruelty without consequences was possible. 3 months later, Benjamin Rourke received a call from Dr. Alice Brennan. Trevor Holloway had been sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Frank Morrison and the other victims had received substantial settlements. Dr. Walsh had lost his medical license and received 5 years for medical fraud. Ronald Pierce had died of a heart attack 2 weeks after his company's bankruptcy, alone in the apartment he'd been forced to rent after losing his mansion. Linda had moved to another state, working as a waitress in a small town where nobody knew her story. Ben felt no satisfaction in any of these outcomes, but he felt no regret either. Justice, he'd learned long ago, was rarely satisfying, but it was always necessary. As he sat in his real office, reviewing files for his next case, Ben reflected on the lesson that had taken him 23 years to fully appreciate. Power without invisibility was merely wealth, but invisibility without power was just hiding. Benjamin Rourke would never hide again. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.